Good morning, Greece and Rome students. Welcome back. And we're going to continue on with chapter 13 today and what happens after Constantine and the Constantinian dynasty. There's a lot going on. We only have about 100 more years of Roman history, so it's going to be very busy and chaotic as we finish up these last two chapters. We talked about Constantine the Great yesterday, and his reign was very instrumental and successful. But when he died, he left power to his sons, three of them. The fourth we talked about had died earlier. He left power to three of his sons, and basically they, due to fighting amongst themselves, but also external threats, within 20 years or so, his three sons had basically frittered away this power, and the Constantinian dynasty fell in just over 20 years. So, kind of unfortunate. Now, at the end of yesterday, we talked about Julian, who was related to Constantine. I looked this up. He was Constantine's, I think, half nephew. So he was in the family. He had been appointed Augustus to help Constantius, but they were almost coming to blows whenever Constantius died unrelatedly. So Julian is left as the emperor at that point. So we're going to start with him today. He becomes emperor in 361 whenever Constantius dies. Now, it's an interesting reign because they had no way to know this. Let me get myself out of here. They had no way to know this. The entire Constantine family was Christians. You know, Constantine had been baptized and converted to Christianity. His sons had become Christians, and so the family was Christian. And so Julian was Christian as far as they knew as well. But it turns out after he became emperor, for years now, it turns out he had kind of, at first quietly and later on openly, reverted back to paganism and kind of rejected Christianity. The Constantine, their family probably could have known that because both of his parents were Christian. They wouldn't have known. But remember, this is still relatively recent that Christianity is becoming more accepted. There's still going to be tons of pagans who are not comfortable with it and not accepting of it. And Julian kind of embraces that. So he had quietly converted to paganism in 351, about 10 years before the death of Constantius. And then once he becomes emperor, he considered it kind of his mission to take the empire more closely back to paganism. He thinks that it was being led astray to go towards Christianity with the Constantines. So early in his reign, he wanted to convert the court, his advisors and stuff, from being more Christian to being more pagan. He invited pagan intellectuals to his court. He openly conducted blood sacrifices, things that would not happen during a Christian emperor. He grew a long beard that was reminiscent of the pagans, and he also just governed in an anti-Christian way. And at this point, he couldn't. He had to be a little careful because there were a lot of Christians in the empire now. It was growing, even though there were a lot of pagans. So he couldn't just do a program to slaughter them all or something. But he certainly tries to make life harder to be a Christian and easier and better to be a pagan. He uses the treasury. Remember, Constantine had used the treasury to build Christian churches, to improve things. Julian tries to switch a lot of this money to build up paganism, to restore pagan temples, and to put towards, making pagans feel more comfortable within the empire. He even writes his own treatise, like an essay, basically attacking Christianity and making the case against them. And this was called Against the Galileans. In the ancient world, sometimes Christians were called Galileans due to Jesus' ministry around the Sea of Galilee. So that's interesting that he actually wrote his ideas down like that. He also was active in fighting against the Persians. He had a big invasion of Persia in the winter of 362 into 363 AD, and this was at Antioch. And there was a controversy here whenever Julian tried to restore a shrine of Apollo at Daphne nearby. And this was unpopular with the mostly Christian population of that city. Remember, Christianity got big in the east before it did in the west. So a city like Antioch would have been a lot more Christian at that point. So the Christian population was offended. We're not having this. And they set the temple on fire. So it's kind of a big controversy, a big thing in the city. Eventually, though, Julian doesn't have time to spend decades trying to take Rome back to paganism. He eventually dies in battle in June 363, fighting against the Persians. And what we learn, what they say about the battle, is that he was hit by a spear fighting against the Persians, right? We can never be completely sure that's exactly what happened, but it does seem like it happened in battle. He would end up being the last, at least openly, pagan emperor. Now, the problem after his death was he had a large army. They were fighting in Persia. And when he dies, it's kind of chaos. The emperor is dead, and now our army is inside of Persia, basically. So the soldiers are going to be in bad shape. And so on Julian's, by the way, I forgot to explain his name. I'm sorry. We call him Julian the Apostate. That's very famously just his name now. And apostate, if you haven't heard that word, apostate is someone who kind of goes against the religion. They turn against the religion or doubt the religion. So that's why he's called Julian the Apostate, because he tried to go against the Christianity of the empire and the rest of his family. So we'll call him Julian the Apostate. But after he died, like I said, the soldiers were stranded in Persia, and so the army was in a bad situation. So the soldiers got together to quickly appoint a new emperor because they needed leadership. They wanted to get out of there, and they appointed one of their own officers, Flavius Jovianus, to get them out of Persia. And we'll call him Jovian just to make it simple. That's what he's known as nowadays. Jovian was in a bad spot, basically, against the Persians, but he was pretty adept and he was able to negotiate a good deal with Persia that helped them basically get out safely and also kind of minimize conflict with Persia going forward. So that's kind of his claim to fame, was putting out this crisis and helping the Romans get away. Unfortunately, Jovian died just within months of becoming emperor, so that was really the one thing he did that was instrumental. But he did that. Another soldier after that was elected to replace Jovian, and this was Flavius Valentinianus, and we'll call him Valentinian. He was elected to replace Jovian early in the year 364. So Valentinian had to figure out how to, govern now that the Persian crisis, at least for a time, is abated. So Valentinian appoints his brother Valens as co-Augustus, right? So the idea of having, the two sides of the empire being run by two different people, and Valens, he brings in his brother. So they decide to divide the duties. Like I mentioned, Valentinian moves to the west to govern the western part of the empire, and Valens stays to take care of things in the east. As far as what they did during this time, Valentinian stayed very busy with threats that we've talked before about them emerging, but now they're becoming more acute. He is fighting a lot of barbarians in the north along the Rhine River, and also even up into Britain. And you see a nice statue of Valentinian here. Valentinian, one of his generals was called Theodosius. He ended up being a very successful general. I mentioned him just because he will become emperor later, and he'll be pretty successful. We'll talk about him. But he was very victorious, a lot of victories over the barbarians, fighting under the emperor Valentinian. Unfortunately for him, Valentinian has a stroke in 375. That's at least the report of his death, as he's negotiating with barbarians in what is now Hungary, and he dies in 375. So, just of his reign here, we see that he spent most of his time fighting, honestly, because the barbarian threat in the north was becoming so fierce. But most people remember him as a decent emperor who tried his best and administered the empire pretty well. So he dies in the west, but remember, Valens is still emperor in the east. So we'll check in with Valens. It's a little bit more complicated now to keep track of everything because you have, multiple emperors at a time now, controlling different parts of the empire, east and west. So what's going on in the east while Valentinian was managing the west? Well, in the east, Valens was also capable, but not quite as militarily successful as his brother. During the first few years of his reign, he kind of had to, I don't know if wasted is the right word, but you had a usurper, someone trying to declare themselves emperor called Procopius. He had been a relative of Julian and trying to play on that family connection to take power. And so he has to spend several years fighting Procopius and eventually puts down that usurper. After that, he battled the Goths, who were kind of various northern tribes that were kind of moving south and encroaching on Roman territory. He fought them up north of the Danube, and basically this turned into a stalemate where he didn't win a big victory, but not a large loss either. In 376, you have a large Gothic uprising that breaks out against Roman rule in Thrace, which was part of Greece, but of course now Roman territory. And what was happening now is it's kind of a big change I hope you'll pay attention to. So these Gothic tribes had been moving south to avoid the Huns, who were now moving into their area. The Huns were coming from the east, right? You've probably heard of the Huns before. So the Huns are moving east, taking over territory of the Goths, pushing the Goths south into Roman territory. And at this time, at least, the Romans were a little bit easier to deal with than the Huns, who were pretty fierce. And so the Goths were taking their chance with the Romans. And so sometimes the Romans didn't have the muscle to to protect their borders completely. So the Goths had been allowed to settle in Thrace, and now there's a large uprising against the Romans by this Gallic force in Thrace. Okay, so a lot of Goths joined into this rebellion, and eventually it broke into a big revolt. Eventually, this turned out very badly for Rome. This collection of Gothic tribes eventually defeated Valens and the Romans at the Battle of Adrianople in 378. It was a large defeat for the Romans. The Emperor Valens is killed, and the Roman army took on heavy losses. So this was a very bad timing of this defeat, and it almost couldn't have gone worse for the Romans here. Of course, the emperor is killed. That's pretty bad as well. The bad part about this is now the Eastern Empire is undefended, and also there's a large group of Goths who are hostile to Rome at least, and they couldn't really go back home because, again, the Huns are moving into their territory. So a really disastrous consequence is losing that battle. If we talk about the empire crumbling in the West, which many books and papers have been written the last few thousand years about why that happened, the loss of the Battle of Adrianople is not the only reason, but certainly a symptom of what was going on. That was a disastrous thing, losing here. So the Emperor Valens dies at this point. So we got to find out who becomes the next emperor in the East and also the West. So Gratian had been appointed Augustus in 367, at just the age of 8. He had grown a bit more now, but it shows you we're starting to have a precedent of people being appointed emperor even when they're or like co-Augustus, even when they're a child. So we're starting to get child emperors. We've had teen emperors before. That goes back all the way to Nero and whatnot. But we're having emperors being declared Augustus when they're even 8 or later on 4, as you can see. So that's just a precedent we're going to see now. So he had grown up a little bit, though. So when Valens dies, Gratian takes over as emperor in the East. Okay, Valentinian II had been appointed Augustus at his father's death in 375. So he becomes emperor in the West at age 4. Obviously, he's going to need regents and people to rule because you can't rule the empire when you're 4. You're not quite ready for it. So Gratian had a terrible task. Whenever he becomes emperor, he has to face the Goths, who basically are controlling the Central Balkans now. They defeated the Romans at Adrianople, so they have really unfettered control of that area, and it's just a very hard challenge. He appoints Theodosius, who up to that point was the empire's most successful general, as co-Augustus to deal with the challenge. So probably a smart move bringing in Theodosius, who had already proven himself to be an effective general, and now Theodosius is co-Augustus with Gratian. So Theodosius fights the Goths. He has some successes against them, but ultimately he still, even him being a pretty good general, doesn't have the power to defeat them. He eventually makes peace with the Goths in 382. As part of that peace, the Goths, were required to fight in Roman armies, but this also granted them the right to their own leadership in Thrace, right? It may not seem like that big of a deal, but if you remember, the Romans, for hundreds of years now, they had a policy. They realized that when you brought in a new tribe or people into the empire, that it was important to break them up, basically, and put them serving in different parts of the empire. That if you have a tribe that is just living together with their own leadership, they never quite acclimate to being Romans. They never quite feel like Romans. They still feel like their original identities. So these Goths here, they're going to play nice with the Romans right now, but if you allow them to live together, they don't have to split up, and they're even having their own leadership, they're not ever fully going to feel like Roman citizens. They're not ever going to fully buy into Rome as they would have before if you had been able to force them to acclimate. So I just want to point out how big of a deal this is at this point, that these Goths now, Rome just doesn't have the power to force them to break up and to acclimate and to move and serve in different parts of the empire. It just shows you Rome's clout at this point. Even though they're still powerful, they're not quite powerful enough to control their own borders like this. So this agreement creates a semi-autonomous barbarian state inside the empire. This precedent, like I just mentioned, will have devastating consequences later. Theodosius was a good general, but Rome just didn't have the ability or power at this point, after just losing the Battle of Adrianople, to force the Goths to do what they wanted. And the next best thing was to make this peace. There may be nothing else he could have done. He might have done the best he could. Um, yeah. So we'll talk about how bad that is later. Luckily for the Romans, the eastern border had been quieter since the Sasanian king Shapur II had died in 379. Of course, after the Romans lost the Battle of Adrianople, the Persians could have used this as a perfect time to attack the Romans, but they were having their own internal problems at this time. So Rome got lucky that the Persians didn't have the resources at this time to attack them. So you can see how the end of Roman history gets very, complex and a bit chaotic because there's so many emperors and there's quick deaths and things like that. But we'll keep up with it. Next time I join with you guys, we'll talk about the reign of Theodosius, who's regarded as a pretty good emperor. We just talked about his military prowess, but we'll talk about him later, and we will finish up chapter 13 tomorrow. But we will end there today. Okay. Thank you guys for listening and following along. Make sure you're also reading your book. It'll all make more sense because the book fills in the holes and stuff, and fills in the little gaps of what I'm talking about. So make sure to be reading along, and I'll be with you tomorrow to finish this chapter up. Okay. Have an excellent day, and I'll talk to you soon.